Hello, everyone. This week's topic is the trickster. Now, thus far, we have examined 3 out of the 4 archetypes that David Leeming describes in his World of Myth, or identifies in his book, The World of Myth. The Great Goddess, the Supreme Being, and the Dying God. And if you remember, we connected the Dying God to the hero's journey or the hero's quest, because the concept of the Dying God, or the archetype of the Dying God, is very closely connected to the monomyth, as it is often called, or the hero's journey or the quest. Often the two of them are interconnected. So this week we examine the topic of the trickster, that last archetype in David Leeming's section on the topic of archetypes. The trickster character is a little bit different than others that we may have examined. Certainly there is an element of comedy or entertainment that comes with the trickster archetype that doesn't come with the other archetypes that we've seen thus far. They tend to be a little bit more serious. So let's just take a look at some central characteristics of the trickster to start with, and then we'll contrast the trickster with the archetype or the concept of the hero and see what similarities and differences we can find. When we discussed culture heroes a few weeks ago, I mentioned that oftentimes culture heroes are trickster characters. They're often characters who bestow gifts on humankind. So we may remember that there are culture heroes who have shared the gift of fire with humankind, or taught humans how to grow crops, hunt certain animals, and so on and so forth. Or perhaps even to how to go about rituals and establish certain ceremonies within cultures. So we see an overlap there between the concept of the culture hero and the trickster archetype as well. Oftentimes, those who bring us gifts are trickster characters because they have to perform tricks in order to get the things that humans need. And even though trickster characters are usually quite self-serving and out for themselves, in the end, the gifts that they bring move human culture forward. And so they do us a service or a favor in their exploits. All right. So as we see trickster characters showing up in myth, they're not necessarily identified as tricksters from the outset. But it's helpful to use the term as a way to kind of classify the character. So in contrast to gods and goddesses, for example, who may be defined in myth as immortals or as gods or goddesses, trickster characters are unlikely to be identified as tricksters within the myths themselves. We just use that term to classify the character and to give it a certain set of traits or characteristics so that it's easily identifiable for us. It's more of an analytical description than a description that might be used in the myth itself. Typically, these characters are quite sly and cunning, and they usually survive by their wits. They use trickery and deceit oftentimes in order to get the things that they would like to get. Oftentimes, however, tricksters are victims of their own plots, and they're usually revealed to be foolish. But they're often able to overcome the problems that they create. In creating those problems or attempting to get the things that they desire, they often experience consequences. As I mentioned, then they're revealed to be foolish. But they overcome this exposure as foolish, and they tend to overcome the consequences, and in the end they tend to get the things they desire. Tricksters are ambiguous characters that embody contradictions. In this way, I think they reveal the complexity of the human nature. Really, humans are complex beings, and tricksters reflect that in myth. So sometimes they can be loners, but then they might use their social skills to charm those whom they are tricking. They can often be very charming and use that charm to get the things they desire. They can sometimes be greedy, but they may also be very generous and capable of self-sacrifice. They may cause trouble, but then they are also very helpful at times. And as I mentioned before, many of them are culture heroes who bring gifts to humankind. So they can also have both destructive and productive behavior. So through their exploits, they may destroy some things, but in the end result of their behaviors or their actions is often good for humanity. Indirectly. Tricksters do not hesitate to cross boundaries of propriety, decorum, or law. So they may be rude, they may lack manners, they may think rules are not for them. They often violate society's conventions, mores, and taboos as well. So tricksters are operating oftentimes outside of an established social structure, rather than succeeding within the social structure, which is what a hero does. And I'll say more about that a little later. Tricksters operate outside of the existing social structure. So they're often viewed as amoral as well. Another characteristic of the trickster is that they may operate as a messenger. They may cross borders, and sometimes they act as intermediaries between mortals and immortals, so between gods and humans. They may carry messages or prophecies from gods to humans, or information about humans to gods. Sometimes they can also be shapeshifters, or they can transform transform themselves, or they can transform their surroundings, right? So in this way, I suppose they can be illusionists or seem as if they are magicians as such. Tricksters tend to appear either as deities, as human beings, or as animals. And in some cultures, animal tricksters are the most prevalent, the most popular. The most common tricksters that we are familiar with are usually from indigenous cultures in North America and in African myths. But of course, there are many others the world over. So, for example, we have Hermes in Greece, we have Krishna in India, Loki in Northern Europe, coyote or raven among indigenous cultures of North America. And we may also have Anansi, the spider, who is one of the most famous tricksters as well amongst the Ashanti people from Africa. David Leeming has to say about tricksters that they are, and this is in quotation marks, always male. He is promiscuous and amoral. He is outrageous in his actions. He emphasizes the lower bodily functions. He often takes animal form. Yet the trickster is profoundly inventive, creative by nature, and in some ways a helper to humanity. Jung sees in him a hint of the latter savior figure. So let's just take that apart a little bit. Now, David Leeming says that the trickster is always male. I don't agree with him here. And actually, this is a quote from C.G. Jung, the psychologist's book called The Four Archetypes. And so actually it's C.G. Jung who's telling us that the trickster is always male. I don't agree with this. I have seen female trickster characters. We see them more often in folktale, I would argue, but they're also present in myth. If we take, for example, the goddess Eris in the Greek tradition, who is also in English referred to as discord. She is the goddess who sends the golden apple into the circle of three goddesses and forces the situation so that the Trojan War comes about. Yes. So, of course, one of the goddesses is chosen to take that golden apple, and then the Trojan War ensues. Yes, as a result of that little story. So Eris is a good example of a trickster character who causes a whole bunch of trouble that leads to disaster for many, but of course, in the end, I suppose, has a positive outcome, if we could consider that the Trojan War did in the end have a positive outcome. That's a whole other lecture entirely. All right. In the realm of folktale, we have, for example, as well, Molly Whuppie. She is a very good example of a female trickster character. So they do exist. So I disagree with C.G. Jung and with Leeming a little bit here. Other aspects of the trickster that are mentioned here, that he is promiscuous, or they are promiscuous, amoral, as I've already mentioned, emphasizes the lower bodily functions. I think by this, C.G. Jung means that the trickster is highly driven by impulse and desire. So, and they tend to have insatiable appetites. And those appetites are across the board. So they may be for food, for drink, they may be connected to sexual exploits, they may be for material goods. And so the trickster seems to operate on instinct and on those desires or pleasures of the very material or very physical world. So even though there may be a magical element to the trickster, and they may perhaps appear to be illusionists in some way, there isn't really a metaphysical aspect to the trickster. The trickster is very physical, very rooted in desire and human impulse. And I think that's what C.G. Jung is referring to here. Okay, so the trickster speaks to our animal nature and to our physical as opposed to our spiritual side, as I mentioned. So C.G. Jung says that the trickster refers to an earlier stage of consciousness. So we could perhaps connect the trickster to ourselves as children and operating in that kind of childlike state. When we are children, we have immediate needs, and we need to have them met, like things like food, sleep, and so on and so forth, comfort. And I think C.G. Jung is referring to this sort of younger, if I can put that in quotation marks, air quotes, or earlier stage of consciousness. So before we sort of reach adulthood, take on responsibilities, and head on a path towards enlightenment. Yes? So the trickster is not up here. The trickster is meeting very basic needs. And I think that's what C.G. Jung is saying. And this is why I think they're, in part, I think they're so entertaining is because even while the rest of us perhaps have to, or yes, have to really take on adult roles in our lives and accept more responsibility and perhaps even more structure as we grow and as we age, the trickster remains a very childlike character with childlike appetites that are many times humorous. And I think that's part of their draw, part of the attraction. So they're charming, but they have the dangerous appetites of a child. They're often untamed by the larger social conscience, so they don't have a social conscience, and they're usually funny, very funny. Now, this isn't necessarily true of all the stories that we have in our textbook, the stories that David Leeming has selected for us as examples of the trickster character. So, for example, if we look at the character of Coyote from many indigenous traditions in North America, Coyote, I would say, as the trickster character, probably has the greatest number of tales. And Coyote does all kinds of things, transforms the world, steals fire at some point for humankind, steals the sun, the moon, so that we can have a sun moon or a day-night cycle, brings about death at some point, steals tobacco, which is necessary for many rituals and ceremonies in indigenous cultures, teaches people how to catch or kill, catch and kill food, for example, how to hunt, likely how to grow crops as well. So Coyote has many, many roles and many, many gifts that the character has bestowed on humankind. And sometimes Coyote can be very funny. In the example that's available to us in the textbook, in the story of Coyote, well, it's a story of firsts, first tears, first sickness, first death, for example. So it's not, I would argue, one of the funnier Coyote tales. It's a little bit more serious in nature. But Coyote does have many, many humorous tales as well. Another really well-known trickster is Anansi the spider, as I mentioned before, from the Ashanti people in Africa. Anansi is responsible for the creation of the moon, as well as many, many other things. And again, there are many tales around Anansi the spider. We also have trickster gods, and two that we may come across are West Africa's fawn people, as well as Yoruba people. We may have Legba from the fawn tradition, and we may have Eshu from the Yoruba tradition. In your textbook, I believe we just have Legba showing up. But both of these gods from West Africa, trickster gods from West Africa, are known to be messengers. And as I mentioned before, tricksters tend to be messengers. These two travel between heaven and earth quite frequently, and they also serve as interpreters for deities as well. So they take on that role. We have monkey tricksters showing up quite commonly. For example, we have Hanuman in India, who we may have seen surface in the story of Rama and Sita in the hero myths section of the textbook. Hanuman, the monkey god, helps Rama to rescue Sita. In the Ramayana, Hanuman is Rama's loyal messenger and leader of the army of monkeys that finds Sita on the island of Lanka and helps to restore order to the world. We also have Sun Wukong in China, who is an unruly monkey character who brings disorder to the heavens, earth, and netherworld during all of his adventures. Now, specifically in the textbook, we have a number of trickster characters, and I'll just go through them quickly here. From Mesopotamia, Sumer, we have Enki and the me. Now, Enki's name means Lord, En, of the earth, Ki. And Enki lives in the underground sweet water, or Apsu, and is associated with irrigation. So we can imagine that Enki is likely a trickster who has helped humankind to grow crops and to water those crops so that they grow. Enki is a culture hero. He teaches people agriculture, as I mentioned, and also the social order, represented by the sacred me. And if you remember, we already came across the sacred me in the story of Inanna Ishtar in the Dying Gods section of the textbook. When Ishtar, or Inanna, decides to travel to the underworld to see her sister Ereshkigal, she has to shed the 7 sacred me, which are representative of the social order of Sumerian society. Those me were or me, depending on how we choose to pronounce them, were previously under the control of Enki until he lost them to Inanna. In the story that we have in the textbook, Enki and the goddess Ninmah are at a banquet, and they have a contest and a kind of game to create humans. And the outcome of that game is the first human. So this is a story of creation of humankind, an anthropogony that is not necessarily based in natural elements or chaotic forces that come together, but instead is based in a drunken contest between Enki and Ninmah. And the outcome of that drunken contest is the first human. So very different from the myths that we see in the creation myths section of the textbook. We do have Greece. We're not going to worry about that. Hermes stealing the cattle, although I'll come back to Hermes shortly. We have from India, Krishna and the gopis. Lord Krishna is an important avatar of the god Vishnu, who we've come to before in the Trimurti. Krishna is a shapeshifter. He is erotic in many ways, and he possesses magical and creative powers. Krishna's trickery often appears amoral, but it usually has a moral purpose. So again, his actions may be perceived as amoral, but the outcome of those actions is actually moral and positive for humankind. In the textbook, we have the tale of Krishna and his connections to the gopis, cowherds, and his various exploits with them. From Iceland, we have, in the Norse tradition, we have Loki, who is well known for his popularization in the Marvel movies with Thor. I would argue that Loki is probably the most malicious of the trickster characters that we find in this section. And he is perceived as evil in many of his descriptions, which I think adds an interesting flavor to his representation, or the Norse representation of the trickster character. Amongst the indigenous people, the Maida, native North America, we have Coyote, as I already mentioned. We have from Central Asia, Erlik. Erlik is referred to as the devil, who is in contrast to the creator. So again, in a similar way to Loki, who is represented as often very evil at times and malicious at times. Erlich is represented as the opposite of the creator. So really embodying also that sort of devil archetype that we're familiar with. In the book, the myth about Erlich is about why humans only have hair on certain parts of their bodies. From Polynesia, the Maori people, we have Maui, and also extending throughout Polynesia as well, I would argue, although Maui is very popular with the Maori people from New Zealand. Maui is well known for his comical and sexual exploits. And we know Maui for his character in the Disney film Moana as well, which is a much more child-friendly version of the Maui stories that we know, and a much more child-friendly version than the version that is present in your textbook, which I would argue is rated R. And a little more sexually explicit. Maui is a culture hero in that he stole fire for the people from Maui Ike in the underworld, as well as many other things or many other gifts that he has bestowed on humankind. He's well known for those and is considered a culture hero for them. From the Africa fawn tradition, as I mentioned before, we have Legba, whose actually herm-like phallic symbol stands outside all of the tribal dwellings amongst the fawn people. This symbol is also well known in Greece as representative of Hermes, whose name is very much like and has the same origin as the word herm. So we see that this phallic symbol is also representative of the trickster exploits, impulsivity, and the effort or the emphasis on realizing your impulsive desires or basic desires. Yes? In the myth from the Africa fawn tradition and with Legba, Legba has a very special relationship with God. He serves as intermediary between God and humans. And he also has a role in divination or prophecy as well. And he carries messages of prophecy. In Legba, we see many characteristics of the trickster that are mirrored in the Greek trickster Hermes, as I mentioned before, who is also a messenger amongst gods and humans, and whose name reflects the symbol of the herm, as I've already mentioned. So these are just a few examples of the trickster character that we come to in the textbook and in the course. Of course, there are many others. What we also want to consider is the differences between the trickster archetype and the archetype of the hero that we have come to, or the characteristics of the hero that we've come to. As I mentioned, trickster characters are also viewed as culture heroes because they bestow gifts on humankind and they have to perform tricks in order to do that. But what would we say are the key differences between the trickster character and the hero as we define the hero in the usual sense? So I would say that the trickster is usually selfish, very often cunning. Sometimes the trickster is a sidekick of a protagonist as well, and seen as a helper who makes things happen for the protagonist of any myth, or sometimes even the hero of a myth, in ways that, again, are a little outside the box. Yes? Tricksters operate in the spur of the moment. They're very impulsive. Oftentimes they have to do damage control because there is an action that they take, then there is a reaction to that action. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, sometimes it has a consequence, and then they fix it or they make things better. And the outcome is usually positive for everyone, even if the middle sort of reaction piece is unpleasant or sometimes devastating, shocking, whatnot, causes more disorder before order. Tricksters are often punished for their actions, but then they recover. So they do actually experience the consequences of their actions. I would contrast this to the hero, who often doesn't have to experience the consequences of their actions. Sometimes they shapeshift, as I mentioned, and they're often childish. They just do what they want, when they want, regardless of the consequences. Okay? We can contrast this with characteristics of the hero. So I would argue that the hero usually has intention. Sometimes a quest, not always, but that the hero is goal-driven. And usually there's a method to achieving that goal. There's a kind of plan, a kind of structure. The hero usually respects authority, in contrast to the trickster, who operates outside of it. The hero usually fixes other people's mistakes. Sometimes they have to fix their own, but usually it's just other people's mistakes that they have to fix. Okay? Usually the hero is easily forgiven. This is not often the case for the trickster. Heroes tend to be selfless, in contrast to selfish, which the trickster tends to be. Heroes are brave, they're strong, usually virtuous, and they adhere to the moral code. Oftentimes heroes are naive. Yeah, so they really haven't, obviously heroes have challenges and tests, but they're not disadvantaged. So oftentimes heroes are chosen, yes? So they may start from a privileged position. In contrast to the trickster, who is usually average or regarded as average and comes from average beginnings or even disadvantaged beginnings, which is part of the reason why they have to play tricks in order to be successful, because they don't start in a privileged position. Oftentimes as well, the hero will take the lead. So they are the central character, and they are idealized as this as well. So these are just some characteristics of the trickster, some examples, and a little bit of contrast with the hero and the trickster as archetypes.